Thank you, Rabbi Rosen. And just to follow up on what Rabbi Rosen said, we live in a wonderful time now where I think there's been much more shared experiences between Jews and Christians than really ever in the past, and particularly in the United States. Part of that has been an interest in Christianity and understanding its Jewish roots, and exploring what the New Testament meant to the writers who wrote it. And that's actually what we're going to focus on tonight. So I want to kind of highlight two separate lines of inquiry that sometimes get confused, and we need to keep them, at least in our minds, as somewhat different. The first is, what did the text mean to the writers who wrote it? Right? What was the world that they were living in? What were they responding to? What were they thinking? What were they trying to describe? And in order to understand that, we've, in the last few decades, uncovered a lot of material. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of archaeology and other historical material we've been able to find to sort of figure out what that world was. And so we can better understand what the text meant when it was written. The other question, as members of our faith traditions, whether you're Christian or Jew, is what does this text mean to us today as a member of this faith tradition? What does this text say to me about the world I live in? And those are two kind of different questions. Most of what we'll be looking at tonight, particularly, is trying to understand what did the text mean to those who wrote it. But in the end, I think the purpose of it is to understand, to inform us about how we can practice our faith today in a way that, that we can acknowledge our differences in our faith traditions, but still appreciate and respect each other despite those differences. And so that's sort of the second question. Now that we know what it meant to the person who wrote it, how does that affect our lives today, and how do we use the text, read the text today for ourselves in a way that helps us to understand each other better and promote a better world for us to live in together? So with that in mind, there's a number of people who have done a lot of research in this area recently, understanding the historical Jesus, and we are blessed in Houston to have one of the experts in the field here at Rice University, Professor Matthias Henze, whose doctorate was in the book of Daniel. For those of you who don't know, in the Jewish world or even in the Christian world, the book of Daniel, modern scholars tell us, was not written by Daniel in Persia in the 400s, but was actually written by somebody around the time of the story of Hanukkah. For those of you who know that, it's about 168 before the Common Era. So I mention that because that is this important period of time in Jewish history between when the Old Testament was what Christians call the Old Testament, we call the Tanakh, was finished, and the time of Jesus. There's a few hundred-year period in between when the Bible was more or less finished and when Jesus appears, that a lot of other stuff was going on. And in order to understand Jesus, we need to understand what happened in those intervening years. One of those things was the book of Daniel being written, and that was the area that Matthias Henze wrote on. In any case, today we have handouts here. And so what I want to do today is we're going to start out with the sample text from the New Testament, from the Gospel of Mark. And I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Henze to explain why this is an interesting passage and a good way to open our conversation.
Thank you very much. Let me start out by saying how delighted I am to be back here at Beth Yeshurun. I was last here in December of 2010 and taught here, I think in this very room, and have wonderful memories. It's wonderful to be back. I would also like to acknowledge that this series was made possible because of Rabbi Morgan, who approached me and asked me whether I would be willing to do a series with him, and I jumped at the opportunity. So thank you very much for your very kind invitation. My hope for this series, let me articulate this right up front, is that we speak openly with one another, that we ask our questions, that we learn from one another, and that we, perhaps at the end of our meeting tonight, also begin to speak about difficult texts. You will see that the handout that you have in front of you has three parts. We begin with an excerpt from the Gospel of Mark, and I will say a few words about this in just a second. We have a short middle part where we will just very briefly look at an excerpt from a book in the New Testament called the Book of Acts, and I will tell you what that is, and compare it with one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But then I think it's important that we get to the third part as well, where we deliberately chose a text that is painful and difficult. And so we want to make sure that we get to that as well. So why don't we start out with the first, unimaginatively, with the first text on your handout from the Gospel of Mark. This is in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, and I will just read the text for you. Again, he, that is Jesus, entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So I would like to offer 3 observations on this text. My first observation simply has to do with context, something that you cannot see on your handout. So in Mark chapters 2 and 3, there are 4 short stories, one after the other, that involve a conflict between Jesus and the disciples on the one hand, and the Pharisees and some other group, sometimes it's the scribes, here it's the Herodians, on the other. So the story that I just read to you is the 4th of these 4 stories, sort of the climactic story of these 4 stories of controversy. So in fact, the last thing that Jesus says in the previous story, before we get to our story, which is also said during the Sabbath day, is the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So there are certain elements that are repeated in these 4 stories. And note that the first word in our story is again. In the Greek, it's palin. So that also links this story with which precedes it. So that's my first observation. We're looking at one story out of 4 stories, one told after the other, all revolving around this idea of controversy. My second observation is that I want to bring to your attention how, quote-unquote, Jewish the scene is that we're witnessing here. For you, this may not be so surprising, but most people who read this text are Christians who know very little about Judaism. So let's be attentive to some of the Jewish elements in our text. The first and most obvious is that the scene is in Israel. You don't know where it is because it's mentioned earlier on at the beginning of chapter 2. We learn that Jesus is in a place called Capernaum, or in Hebrew, Kfar Nachum, which is a little fishing village on the western shore of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. So we are northern Israel. Second, the story takes place on the Shabbos. Third, takes place in a synagogue. Fourth, there are Pharisees and this group called the Herodians, about whom we know not very much. And fifth, implied in this story is a certain culture of religious debate over what one can and cannot do on the Sabbath day. So I point this out because these 5 elements are not incidental, and you will find none of these 5 elements in the Tanakh. So if you wanted to know more about this, you wanted to know, what did one do on the Sabbath day? Or who are these Pharisees? Or what's the synagogue? Many Christians who don't really know very much about Judaism would turn to the first part of the Christian Bible, the Old Testament, only to see that it doesn't really help. That is to say, Mark presupposes a Jewish world that he doesn't explain because he assumes that we know what he's talking about. My third and last observation, then I hand it back to Rabbi Morgan, is a simple question. What is this story all about? Why does Mark tell us this story? So if you go to Barnes & Noble and you buy a deluxe English Bible, Your modern translator will insert little superscriptions, little titles, right? And a common title for our story is like Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath day. Most New Testament scholars will tell you that's a story about healing. Jesus heals a man with a withered hand. Okay, so I ask my students, I do this often, what's the name of the man? What does the man say? Does he want to be healed? Does he say, thank you, Jesus, that was awfully kind of you? What happens to him afterwards? We don't really learn very much about the man, do we? He doesn't say very much. He doesn't have a name. So if this were a story about him, why does Luke not tell us anything about him? So perhaps it is not a story about the man. Perhaps Luke doesn't give us his name, Mark doesn't give us his name because it's not his story. Perhaps the story is about something else. So let's look at the story again. And let's just assume that Mark is a master storyteller. Mark is a brilliant storyteller. There's nothing incidental. And so if we look at the story again, we see that the story actually has a frame. It begins in verse 2 and it ends in verse 6 with the bystanders, whom he identifies as the Pharisees. So in verse 2 we read, they, that is the Pharisees, watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And then Mark picks this up at the end of the story again, right? There's no happy ending here. You would think there is, but there isn't. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians again how to destroy him. So perhaps this is not a story about healing. Perhaps the healing is just a peg on which to hang something else. This is a story about controversy. This is a story about a controversy between Jesus and the Pharisees. The reason why I point this out is that there's a certain danger here, that we read this and that Christians have read this story for 2,000 years and just go away and think, yeah, he's telling us who these Pharisees are. They are scheming. They want to accuse and they want to kill Jesus. There's a certain danger that there is a subtle message that you take away. You think you're reading a story about healing, but you're being fed a whole lot of other information. Just want to raise this as an issue. How we deal with it is a different story, but I think it bears mention.
So that's why we brought the second text, which is kind of what's going on in the Jewish world, maybe a little bit after the book of Mark is written. This is a text from the Mishnah. So those of you who don't know, the Mishnah is sort of a collection of rabbinic writings about what Judaism was like around the year 200. Right? So what the rabbis did after the temple was destroyed is to fashion a sort of systematic understanding of Judaism without a temple. And it includes also rules about the temple, but mostly they were writing about how to deal without a temple. And so this is called the Mishnah. And it's organized into 6 major categories. One of them deals with the calendar, and one of them deals with agricultural laws. And this one comes from the section dealing with the calendar laws. Yoma is the section in that category that deals with the law of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And in it, it has the following ruling. If one is seized with a pathological craving for food, he is to be fed on Yom Kippur, which is a fast day for those of you who don't know about the day. I mean, you're not supposed to eat anything this day. But if this person has a pathological craving for food, you violate the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, by giving him food, even if it's unkosher food, right? And until he recovers. Now, I'm going to skip the next sentence because it's apparently about medical wisdom from 1,500 years ago that doesn't really apply today. So we're going to skip that sentence. And the next sentence says, moreover, Rabbi Matya ben Harash said, if a person has a sore throat, is permitted to put medicine in his mouth on the Sabbath because of the possible danger to his life. And whatever threatens to endanger life supersedes the observance of the Sabbath. So this is a Jewish text, probably written shortly after the book of Mark is written, which is telling you that Jews are already saying if you have to violate the Sabbath to cure somebody, so you cure him. What I found really remarkable is this comment, and the next part, Yoma 85b, is indicating a page of Talmud. The Talmud includes a commentary on the Mishnah. So this is a comment from the Talmud on the text we just read. Rabban Yonatan ben Yosef says, for it is, quoting the book of Exodus, it is sacred to you, right? The Sabbath is sacred to you. This implies that the Sabbath is given into your hands, and you are not given to it to die on account of the Sabbath, which sounds to me an awful lot like the quote that Professor Henze said from Mark, just the chapter before, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not the humankind for the Sabbath. So in the Jewish world, virtually the same conversation is going on, and the conclusion amongst the rabbis, who consider themselves, by the way, the inheritors of the Pharisaic tradition, so the people that Mark is saying are opposed to Jesus, the Pharisees, perhaps would have come to the very similar conclusion that Mark does, that you should heal somebody on the Sabbath.
The question is one of context. In what context do we read the Gospel of Mark? If we read it within the context that Rabbi Morgan has just explained to us, what Jesus is doing is that he participates in an ongoing, disputatious dialogue over what you can and cannot do on the Sabbath. And any sane man would have said, presumably this man has had a crippled hand all of his life. Jesus, you might have well have waited a day and do it on a fine Monday or Sunday morning. What's wrong with you? However, if you don't know anything about this context, and if you read the story completely out of context, this quote in Jesus' mouth that I just read to you from the previous chapter and that Rabbi Morgan has put on the handout here would very much read as if Jesus was basically abolishing the Sabbath. Like, what is this? I can do on the Sabbath whatever I want. So there's an inclination, if you don't know about the Jewish context of the New Testament, to think of Jesus as a radical who puts himself over above the law and what you can and cannot do. Now, the authors of the New Testament were keenly aware that there's a certain danger of misreading Jesus in this way. And one author who was particularly aware of this was the author of another gospel, the first gospel that we have in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. Now, this is a bit troubling about Christianity. We have 4 gospels, and you just imagine you would have 4 Torah scrolls. Just imagine, like one, I don't know, the Torah of Moses, the Torah of Aaron, the Torah of, I don't know, you mentioned.
Joshua. Whatever.
Right, exactly, Joshua and a few others. So that's what we're dealing with. So we're jumping now with your next text on your handout. We're jumping from one gospel to the other, and here particularly to the Gospel of Matthew. I'll give you a little bit of context here. Matthew is the longest of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. It was very likely written by a Jewish author who became a follower of Jesus to a predominantly, if not exclusively, Jewish audience. The Gospel is structured around 5 speeches which the evangelist Matthew puts into the mouth of Jesus. And so your excerpt here in chapter 5 is taken from the first and perhaps most famous of Jesus' speeches in the Gospel of Matthew. It is in Matthew 5 through 7 and is known as the Sermon on the Mount. So why don't I just read to you this short text here. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, and this last verse I think is very important, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So immediately following our passage comes a very famous passage in the Sermon on the Mount, not on your handout, of a sequence of 6 sayings. Jesus is teaching his followers, and he gives them these 6 sayings that are often called antitheses. Why? Because of their structure. What Jesus does with each of these 6 sayings is he starts out by saying, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times. So he's basically quoting from the law and from the interpretation of the law. And then he adds in each of these 6 times, but I say to you, and then he adds his own, in each case more radical, more stringent interpretation. So on the surface, it might seem that Jesus is here replacing the Mosaic Torah, the law, with his own teachings. Matthew knew that people might misconstrue this, and so he prefixes these 6 sayings with this short passage that we have just read in order to preempt, to prevent any wrong interpretation. The very purpose of our section then is to preempt any such misunderstanding and make clear that Jesus' intention is not to abolish the law, not to say what he is teaching replaces the Mosaic Torah, but rather he's trying to get at the core of it. He is, in fact, radicalizing the interpretation of the Torah, which is why he is saying, and I think this is very important, I tell you, unless your righteousness, that's one of Matthew's favorite terms, exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
So I should add one other thing. Sometimes I hear somebody say, it says this in the Talmud says this about a subject, or the Talmud says that about a subject. And I find that sometimes a little bit irritating because the Talmud itself doesn't really say anything. Individual rabbis in the Talmud say something, and anybody who's studied Talmud knows that in any page of Talmud, there are rabbis saying things that often disagree with each other. So the Talmud is full of arguments. So for the Talmud to say one thing, you can often find the Talmud saying something very different on the same subject, and even on the same page, because different rabbis are speaking. And the problem of having different gospels is a little bit like that, I think, right? Because they're all saying something perhaps slightly different, and it's important to pay attention to who's saying what. So, for instance, even on the argument about what you can do on the Sabbath, I quoted you one passage of the Talmud that would suggest you can violate the Sabbath to heal somebody. And that turns out to be, I would say, the majority opinion. But that's not to say that that would not have been an argument that the Talmud would record. And there was no doubt some rabbi who said, no, you can't, right? So just to know, that there was part of that back and forth argument that was going on. Before we kind of leave this section, I want to kind of overview, because many times in the Gospels, the Pharisees are the foil in the story, so that the Pharisees don't get good press generally in the New Testament. That's probably because their party is the one that survived the destruction of the temple and was the most popular party at the time of the early Christian movement. And so it doesn't pay to beat up on the Sadducean party, for instance. That was the party of the priests and the upper class in Jerusalem. Once the temple is destroyed, that class more or less disappears. So that you would be beating a dead horse, so to speak. Right? So if you're going to have a dispute, you're trying to differentiate yourself from the Jewish world. The world you're trying to differentiate yourself from would be the Pharisees. Unfortunately for us today, right, the Jewish world sees ourselves as the inheritors of the Pharisaic tradition because the rabbis in the Talmud see themselves that way. On the other hand, what I want to point out here is that while the Pharisees seem to be antagonistic to Jesus, there are many aspects of the Pharisaic thinking that are, in fact, part of how Christians look at the world. Perhaps the most important one is a belief in resurrection of the dead. So the Pharisees believed that there was a life after death. The Sadducees, the party of the priests, did not. They thought this is all there is to life, and once you die, that's it. Pharisees said, no, there is an afterlife. The problem for Jews is they had many different ideas about what that afterlife is like, one of them being a spiritual afterlife, and the other one is this resurrection of the dead. The idea being that righteous people who lived in generations when the world was at war and at strife and there was anger and poverty and bloodshed, right? It's not fair that righteous people should only live in a miserable world. So when the Messiah comes, this was a Pharisaic teaching, when the Messiah comes and the world becomes all at peace and people are living in peace and prosperity and happiness, right? Righteous people who didn't have an opportunity to live in that world should be resurrected. Their bodies will be restored. God will make a miracle happen. Their bodies will come back to life, and their souls will be put back in their body, and they'll have an opportunity to live in this ideal world. That was a Pharisaic teaching, and clearly one that's very crucial for understanding at least the resurrection of Jesus, but I think certainly how Christianity understood that. One of the things that they may have disagreed on is the Pharisees believed that they inherited a way of understanding the Bible that dated back to the time of Moses. So in classic Jewish teaching, God is sort of dictating the 5 books of Moses to Moses, and he's writing it down dutifully word for word, right? But then God would say to Moses at some point, put down your pen, and now I'm going to tell you what this means. And I don't want you to write this down because I want this to be oral. And I want you to transmit what I'm going to tell you to Joshua, and Joshua's going to transmit it to the elders, and then the judges, and then the prophets, right? And eventually it'll get written down in a later book called the Talmud, right? But this, so this is an oral interpretation. The Pharisees believed they inherited this chain of oral interpretation of the Bible that dated back much of it to the time of Moses. The Sadducees didn't believe in that, and we're not sure, but it seems that in at least some of the Gospels, they also disagree with that, yes? Or
with the oral Torah? Yes,
yeah,
they also
yes.
disagree with it.
They also
yes,
disagree with the oral Torah.
Yes, right.
And the other thing is that the Pharisees were, it's important to know, were a sort of a populist movement. The Sadducees, as I said, was a party mostly of the priests and the aristocracy in Jerusalem, but at least according to Josephus, a Jewish historian, the Pharisees was a more popular movement among more of the masses of the Jewish people, which is why they survived and then unfortunately became part of this debate with the early Christian group.
All right, let's move on to point number 2 on your handout. And as I said beginning, I think we'll be a little briefer here because the point to be made here is not difficult to grasp. I have put on the handout for you 2 texts. The first comes again from the New Testament, and the second is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We begin with the New Testament. This is taken from the 5th book in the New Testament. So we have the 4 Gospels, and the 5th book in the New Testament is called the Book of the Acts of the Apostles, or briefly known as the Book of Acts. What is it all about? It is about the story about the followers of Jesus. What happened after Jesus ascended into heaven? And the Book of Acts is basically 2 parts. It begins at that crucial moment and stays in Jerusalem for the first half of it, and tells us the story of the apostles, how they organized themselves, and how they continued to transmit the earliest Christian teachings. And then in the second half of the book, the author follows Paul, the apostle Paul, on his travels, and the book ends in the city of Rome. So the passage that I've picked for you here is from the end of the 2nd chapter. Let me just read it to you. They, that is the followers of Jesus, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So why did Rabbi Morgan and I choose this passage? I think there are three aspects about this text I want to point out very briefly before we move on to the next text. So the first is that not only was Jesus a Jew, as we just saw in both the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, but those who followed him, at least the majority of the earliest followers, were also Jewish. Not only were they Jewish, but they continued to live their life within the Jewish faith and with all the Jewish customs of their time. Their lives were in fact centered on the Jerusalem temple. This is what we learn right at the beginning of the book of Acts. And as we read here in chapter 2, they formed closely knit communities. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we can say something about the form of their communal lifestyle, namely that it is very similar to what we know from at least one Jewish group, which we know at the time, namely the Essenes. So Rabbi Morgan mentioned the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The first century Jewish historian Josephus says that there were three groups: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And we know quite a bit about the Essenes. And it so happens that what we learn about the early Christians, according to the book of Acts, happens to resemble a whole lot what we know about the Essenes. The strict hierarchy, the sharing of goods, the praying and studying together, the being obedient to their leadership, and so on and so forth. Very similar to what we know about the Essenes. And third, I think this passage is important for us to understand that in the first century, there really was no such thing as Christianity. If we understand Christianity as a religion that defines itself in opposition to Judaism, as an independent, freestanding religion, then there was certainly no such thing in the first century. What scholars call parting of the ways, the breaking away from Judaism and making claims that we're now our own religion, happened at a later stage. But throughout the first century, there really was no such thing as Christianity. And in fact, most of my colleagues really changed their vocabulary that they use in their classes. They talk about Jesus followers or those who believed in Jesus, but they purposefully avoid the term Christianity when they talk about anything that has to do with the New Testament or even the first century. The crucial question is, when does this happen? When does the parting of the way really manifest itself? And people like me write about this endlessly. It keeps like people of me off the road. Much debate. Later on during the question and answer, I tell you the truth about it. But right now, I'll just keep it at that. And we'll move, in order to save time, to the second passage. So what's the second passage? The second passage is taken from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, these mysterious Jewish fragments discovered on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. This text is called the Serech HaYachad, something like the order of the community. And it reads very much like the bylaws of Beth Yeshurun. We all have the bylaws that nobody reads. That's what this is. These are the bylaws of the Dead Sea sect, which is actually kind of cool because it tells us how this group was organized. Who were their leaders? How did they spend their days? What did they believe in? Right? That's not why you read bylaws, but that's why I could read bylaws. And so the passage that I've picked for you here is from a section that talks about the somewhat painful process of welcoming new members. It was an arduous 2-year process. And what I want you to do, I want you to pay attention to two things. One, the vocabulary. Note, for example, that it talks about the many, spelled with a capital M. There's no capital writing in Hebrew. You all know this. This is your English translator. The many is a technical term for the full voting members of the Qumran community. And notice also that there is a character named the inspector. He is one of the membership team, a colleague of Rabbi Morgan's, if you will. So that's the first thing I want you to pay attention to, the vocabulary, the special vocabulary of the sect. And the second thing I want you to pay attention to is how this text, in fact, resembles the section from the book of Acts. So on the way out, there's a little quiz there, and I will ask you to note all the parallels. So let me read to you from 1 QS 6. When he, that is the hopeful who wants to join the community, has completed a year within the community, the many will be questioned about his affairs, concerning his insight and his deeds in connection with the law. And if the lot results in him entering the inner council of the community, according to the priests and the majority of the men of the covenant, his possessions and his earnings will also be joined at the hand of the inspector of the earnings of the many. And they shall credit it to his account, but they shall not use it for the many. He must not touch the drink of the many until he completes a second year among the many of the community. And when the second year is complete, he will be examined by command of the many. And if the lot results in him joining the community, they shall enter him in the order of his rank among his brothers for the law, for the judgment, for purity, and for the placing of his possessions. And his advice will be for the community as well as judgment. So you see, there's an arduous process with lots of public examinations, and if you're lucky, they refer to it as the lot, meaning whether they give you the thumbs up or the thumbs down, right? But if you're lucky, you're gradually phased into the life of the community, and we could talk about this endlessly, and I promise I won't, but the one thing I will point out is that as you join the community, you gradually give up your possessions. And we read elsewhere in 1Q as not just your possessions, basically your everything. All of your belongings, but also your identity. You take on a completely new identity. Of a doctoral student at Rice who writes a dissertation about this transformation, this becoming part of a sect and assuming a new identity. Very similar to what we read about the early Christian group.
Okay, so now we're going to turn to, the reason for pointing that out was just to say that this is another aspect of trying to understand Jesus in his world. And so there's a number of things we could say that are similar between Jesus and his followers and the Pharisees, but there are also some similarities with some things going on in the Essene sect, and which is all to say that in order to understand fully what's going on in the New Testament, you have to understand what was going on in the Jewish world in the first century. And now we know some about that, and this is just a way to describe that. We now want to turn to one of the troubling passages. There are a few. We decided to choose just one. The reason we chose just one is just to sort of indicate how to approach this text, different ways we can approach this text to try and create an understanding between ourselves, recognizing the fact that it is a sacred text for Christians, but also that it has problems in how it can be interpreted with respect to Jews, and how we might then want to reinterpret it for our communities when we do dialogue with each other. So we'll take a look. This is from the book of Matthew.
Mm-hmm. So again, to give you some context, we're towards the end of the gospel. Jesus, at the beginning of the chapter, is brought before Pontius Pilate, and things deteriorate rather quickly. Jesus is accused publicly, and Judas, who has just betrayed Jesus, has just committed suicide. So we're in a not-so-good part of the gospel, shall we say. We know that Pilate himself was, from historical sources, was not a friendly chap, so things get a little tense. Why don't we just read this very short passage there? When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but that instead a riot was breaking out, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "You shall bear the responsibility." All the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." You want to say a few words? I want to say whoever.
Yeah. So first of all, how
said,
many Jewish people here, sort of a show of hands, have heard this passage before? Okay.
Yeah.
So this was a passage that caused a lot of grief for the Jewish world over the centuries. The implication seems to be that the Jews are, and this is how it was interpreted by the church for many centuries, the Jews are forever sort of responsible for the death of Jesus. His blood be upon us and on our children. I was going to start out this evening talking about Vatican II, so let me just say a few words about that. In 1965, the Catholic Church convened a major conference to re-examine some of its basic doctrines. And out of that conference came a very long series of promulgations, 3 of them relating to Jews that were really very crucial. The first one was, with respect to this particular issue, that perhaps, this is what they said, perhaps a few Jews at the time of Jesus' death may have been involved in his prosecution, but it was nevertheless a Roman court that prosecuted him, convicted him, and crucified him. Only Romans were allowed to crucify. That was a Roman punishment. And that no Jews since that time bear any responsibility for Jesus' death. So in other words, a few Jews might have had something to do with his death at the time, even though it was a Roman trial, but no Jews since then had anything to do with it, and perhaps most Jews at the time of Jesus' death also had nothing to do with it. So that was the first issue they absolutely said. The second thing they said was a doctrine that, again, had been very popular in the Christian world for centuries, which is that the New Testament, that is the new covenant, the new contract with God and humanity, the new path towards having a relationship with God, the one through Jesus, has replaced the old covenant, the Old Testament, the one that was with the Jews. And so every time in the Old Testament, when it talks about having a covenant between God and the Israelites, that covenant now is the covenant between God and the new Christian world, right? This doctrine was called, had a big term, supersessionism, which meant that the church superseded the Old Covenant, or sometimes in more plain English was called replacement theology, right? That the Christian church had replaced the Jewish covenant. So now in Vatican II in 1965, the church said, we no longer will teach that. That is false doctrine. It is no longer to be part of church doctrine. The Jews, this was kind of a shocking statement really for the Catholic Church to make, the Jews have an independent relationship with God that is outside of the church and is forever. And we don't have anything to say about that. That's between them and God. So a very huge break with prior tradition that the Catholic Church said in Vatican II. The third thing the Catholic Church said is we will not tolerate any form of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is now anathema to the church. Now, I mentioned that, of course, in America, most Christians are Protestant. However, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, I believe, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which Professor Henze is part of, have all kind of adopted similar policies. And that really, what Rabbi Rosen was describing at the beginning of our conversation really has completely changed the entire dynamic of the Jewish Christian world since the 1960s. And that's really what's enabled us to really have this wonderful experience that we have today where we can communicate and we don't communicate in anger and frustration with each other, right? Because we've sort of gone past that. But nevertheless, this text is the text that gave rise to this idea that the Jews were responsible for Jesus' death, and so much so that I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, in the 1960s, right, about the time the Vatican II was coming out. This only happened to me once, thankfully. I was playing on my front yard in Tucson, Arizona, minding my own business, when some kid on a bicycle rode by and called me a Christ killer. And being innocent as it was, I had no idea what he was talking about. I had to ask my parents what that meant. But in any case, so it only happened once, but again, that world is completely changed now.
So I want to make 2 remarks, one about the text from Matthew, and then I want to add a remark about supersessionism. So first, about Matthew 27. Of course, there are modern commentators who write commentaries on every conceivable and a few inconceivable aspects of the Bible. So when you go to the commentators on the Gospel of Matthew and you look up this particular passage, you will always see 2 explanations, always. The first one is that the modern interpreter will explain to you that the Jews in the Gospel of Matthew are not the Jews throughout the centuries, but, as Rabbi Morgan correctly pointed out, that there's a specific historical context. Now, how the commentator will then identify the Jews varies from commentator to commentator. Some will say it was the Jewish elite. Others will say, no, these are the Jews of Jerusalem. Others will say just a few Jews. That doesn't really matter. But the commentator will be at pains to say that those who are mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew are not Jews throughout the centuries, but are in fact the Jews of the time of Jesus, and that Matthew, when he wrote his Gospel, didn't really think of Beth Yeshurun in the 21st century in Houston. And we should take this seriously. That's the first thing that commentators will say. The second thing that commentators will point out, correctly I believe, is that the Gospel of Matthew was written after the year 70, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And what Matthew does throughout, he puts into the mouth of Jesus predictions of the destruction of the temple. I mentioned earlier on that Matthew is one of the most Jewish Gospels that we have. Matthew knew of an early Jewish interpretation of the destruction of the temple in the year 70 as a divine punishment. You see this throughout Jewish literature. So Matthew adopts this explanation. Yes, indeed, the destruction of the temple was a punishment. However, he changes the argument a little bit and says it was a punishment for not accepting Jesus as a Jew. And so the second thing that commentators point out about this particular passage is it's Matthew's way of putting into the mouth of Jesus a prediction of the destruction of the temple and making clear, see, you were wrong. You should have accepted him as Messiah. So again, very historically specific. And the third thing that modern commentators point out is that we are, as I mentioned earlier on, late in the gospel. And if you read the Gospel of Matthew carefully, you will see that in the beginning, Jesus is still kind of friendly towards Judaism. I read to you a passage from chapter 5. I have not come to abolish the law. And you can see throughout the gospel that there's a certain sense of frustration growing, that Jesus becomes angrier and angrier, particularly with regards to Israel. And so here we are in the second to last chapter of the gospel, and you can just see that Jesus, Matthew, I should say, is lashing out. He is really getting very, very angry. So all of these, I think, are attempts, all of these three explanations are attempts to put the text in its place and say, no, 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 this is by no means to be read as a judgment on Judaism in general. I think these are good explanations. I wonder whether this solves the problem, though. And I wonder whether there is not still a problem that we need to address. And I'm very grateful to you that you mentioned supersessionism. So let me just say a few words. So I'll put in a shameful plug for a book that I wrote recently. It's on your handout in the bibliography. It's called Mind the Gap, and I'll talk more about it when we come back next week. In the book, I talk also about supersessionism, and I explain why this has been around in Christianity and why it is wrong. And then I submitted my manuscript to the publisher, Fortress Press, and an editor read the book and said, I like it very much. I have very few requests. However, you talk about supersessionism. I really want you to make very clear that this is not what mainline Christian denominations teach today. You make it out as if this was still around. And we all know that since Vatican II and all the other Protestant churches have followed suit, this is just not the case. So please, put in a disclaimer and say, yeah, this is what Christians thought back then, but nowadays nobody believes in supersessionism, right? Nobody believes that the church has replaced the synagogue. And I said, with professorial authority, okay. And so I put in a disclaimer. I said, all right, this is not what Christians believe. I'm giving a lot of talks about my book in lots of churches. And so I asked my audience, Now, let's be honest. What do you think? And invariably, the nicest people on planet Earth say, of course we are supersessionists. This is what we've been told. Why? Is there anything wrong with it? And these are not vicious people. These are not people who hate Jews or Judaism. It is just sheer ignorance. It's not ill will, but it is supersessionism is alive and well. Absolutely. And so with all due respect to my darling colleagues at Fortress Press, it may well be that we're in a post-Vatican II world, and it may very well be that we've made tremendous progress, but we're not quite there yet. That's all I want to say.
Okay, there are some other ways to contextualize Matthew here that are on the outline. I think, though, that given the time, rather than look at those, I do want to have an opportunity for you all to ask questions. And so I think does somebody here have a microphone that we can use? Here's a microphone.
There's one here.
I can speak pretty well. So, when we were growing up as Presbyterians, when we read that the blood was on us, the way we interpreted it was us, Presbyterians. So, in other words,
Very nice.
it was not. Hello?
Yeah.
There you go.
I mean, in other words, the way we read this was that it was really just the reality that we, or I should say that Jesus was atoning for our sins, and so that the blood of Jesus was on us. Well, of course, it was on us. If there were a blood libel, it is on all people who have not repented and averted turned their eyes towards God. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's interesting. When I read this and I said, what, there's people saying this was a blood libel? I said, if there's a blood libel, we all have a blood libel. In other words, it never made any sense to me the way we were raised that there was a blood libel, because by definition, we're all part of the blood libel because Jesus died on the cross for all of us. So, just to give you a different spin on that. So, because I never understood it as a Christian reading it, how could there be a blood libel?
Sure. Yeah, so the text makes very clear that the people who speak in verse 25 are in fact the Jews, right? So if you read the story on its face value, it's very clear that the people who say this are the Jews who are present at that moment. But of course, it's open to all kinds of interpretations.
Well, I mean, I was just trying to say that, of course, there were Jewish people because they were in Jerusalem.
Right.
In other words,
Right.
if it had happened in Rome, they would have been Romans.
Right. Right.
So in other words, we just never, when in the church I was in,
Okay.
it was never even a thought.
Good. Very
Okay.
good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'd like to look at the first page, the passage from Matthew.
Uh-huh.
Is it on?
It's on. You're good. Uh-huh.
Right up to my mouth. There
Yeah.
we go. Hey. The passage from Matthew where he's not come to abolish the law, I'd like to look at that last sentence and get a little more insight into it, because
Yes. Good.
when
Good.
I've read this sentence, on my own reading the Gospels, and then here again, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I always read this with a bit of sarcasm in Jesus' tone there, that,
He's making a snide remark about the scribes and Pharisees.
right.
Yeah.
Is that, can you guys give me a little more contextual insight on that?
Good question.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I buy that. I think he's quite sincere there, because he comes back to that later in the gospel in a text that you don't have on your handout. I told you that this is followed by these antitheses, right? These you have heard, but I say to you. And so let me just read to you how all of this ends. The last verse, this is in Matthew 5, verse 48. He says to those who are listening to him, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." So I think what this is all about is that Jesus is taking on not the law per se, but the way in which the law has been interpreted. And he says it's not enough. You need to do even more. And even the professionals, as it were, the scribes and the Pharisees, don't really get at the core of it. The core for him, for Matthew, are issues like righteousness, this is why he mentions it, and attainment of perfection. So I think he's really pushing his followers and say, what's wrong is not the law, but the wrong is how you interpret it. And he wants to tighten the screw. So ironically, Christians read this as an abolishment of the law, where I think what Matthew is saying is the exact opposite. You need to do even better than the Pharisees. Is that sort of snippish towards the Pharisees? I really don't think so. I think he's sincere. I think he's saying, try a little harder if you want to get access into the kingdom of God.
So two things I would say about that. First, as we've talked before outside of this program, Matthew is, on the one hand, the most Jewish of the Gospels, but on the other hand, seems to be also the most bitter, particularly toward the end.
Yes.
And sort of really lays into the Pharisees with some pretty, some other passages that we didn't use tonight. And so, but one way to try and understand Matthew, I would say, is the problem we have in reading Matthew today is we know what happens next. 300 years later, the Roman Empire becomes Christian. And after that, the relations between Jews and Christians gets very, very bad. But at the time Matthew's writing, it's long before that's happened. So Matthew is writing about a different situation. He's bitter, he's angry, and he's venting his frustration. And I almost read what he's writing, and this is not to say it's okay or that it's, whatever, but to say that if you're in an argument with your brother or your sister about something, right, sibling rivalry, and you see things differently, you tend to get much more angry than if you're talking to somebody you don't know. And the problem is that it's like, you're so much like me. You see everything else the same way. Why don't you get this? And there must be something wrong with you. And I picture that was part of this argument that Matthew was dealing with. He's trying to talk to Jews after the destruction of the temple and tell them that 35 years ago the Messiah had come. So for most of the Jewish world, that's like, what are you talking about? Because as we're going to talk about next week, for most of the Jewish world, the Messiah was supposed to be George Washington, right? Who was going to lead the Revolutionary Army against the Romans, and we're going to get rid of them from our country. Not only did Jesus not do that, but now the temple's destroyed. What kind of Messiah are you talking about? And in the tension between these two very different ideas about Messiah that we're going to talk about next week, right, Matthew gets very upset because he's not part of this community. The other people are upset because they don't understand what he's talking about. And I think his anger comes out of this. Again, it doesn't mean that the things he says are okay, but at least you can understand and contextualize why he says some of the things he does. Now, but going back to another point you made, though, in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the things he says, which we didn't include in our text here, was he says, you've been told that you should love your friends or hate your enemies, and I tell you should love your enemies. Something I'm not good at quoting the New Testament.
Doing pretty well.
And so I took that as a challenge, and I looked and I tried to research and find places in rabbinic teachings, the Talmudic teachings, that teach the same thing. And I found a number of parallel sources, which we didn't include here because we didn't want to get into that. But I point that out to say that when Jesus is saying you need to try harder, you need to be more perfect, even love your enemies, right?
Exactly.
There were rabbis who were saying the same thing.
Right.
The difference, I think, for Jews, if you want to try and understand the Jewish perspective, is the rabbis were trying to they actually had authority. And they were trying to create a law that people could actually live with. And most people can't live with a law that says love your enemies. Right? So when they're setting a baseline of what they hold as acceptable, they're not going to say that. But they will still say the ideal is, and one of the way they phrased it was, to turn your enemy into your friend. Right? That's a passage we find in rabbinic teaching. So very similar ideas, but they admit the same goal, but set a different baseline.
Very good. How are we doing on time?
Oh.
I'm
We have to take a
wondering
couple
if
more.
the expression "kingdom of heaven." I'm over here.
Oh, right.
Sorry.
It's hard to tell with the
Right,
speakers.
it's like,
Yeah, right. Where is this
I'm
question?
everywhere. Um,
share
The
mine.
expression "kingdom of heaven"
Yeah.
is not something that Jews today use, and I understand about the Pharisees believing in resurrection, but if Matthew is mostly speaking to Jews, how is he expressing the desirability of this kingdom of heaven, of wanting to be there, and what is so great about it, and why is that something that we should be pursuing?
yeah.
Well, let me first say that there is an idea. I mean, Ol Malchut Shemayim, the yoke
right.
of the kingdom of heaven, right? We do have the idea of a kingship of heaven. The problem I think maybe you're saying is our vision again of the Messianic era is the Messiah is going to come. There's going to be universal peace on earth, brotherhood, prosperity. Jews will be returned to Israel from the exiles. We'll have our own independent government, et cetera, none of which happened. So when Christians talk about the kingdom of heaven, they're talking about something that's different from what the Jewish expectation was.
So one of the things that I find really striking about reading the New Testament and all of these early Christian voices about Jesus is how relatively little there is in terms of remembering the good old days when Jesus was with them. There's very little, drinking chamomile tea and lighting a candle and exchanging stories. But rather, the followers of Jesus have really turned around and were very much an eschatological group. That is to say, they were thinking that Jesus would come again and that he would come again very soon.
Very soon.
The earliest Christian author of whom we have any writings is the Apostle Paul, whom I mentioned earlier. And it is quite clear from his writings that Paul expected to be alive when Jesus would come again. So I think all of this talk about Malkuta Shamayim and what have you is an expression of an extremely high degree of anticipation that Jesus' earthly life was just the beginning of the ushering in of the end of time. And so I think it's important to bear in mind when you read the New Testament that many of these authors don't write with the expectation that what they're laying out would be teaching forever and ever, but they're really thinking that very soon Jesus will come again. It explains some of the radical notions and the ethics that we see in the New Testament as well. So I think we need to read the kingdom of heaven language in that context.
I have a question on the lines, "You shall bear the responsibility, his blood be on us and on our children." Is that sentiment expressed anywhere else in the New Testament? And if not, do you think had he not written those words, how it would have affected history after that time?
Yeah, so they're not expressed anywhere else. This idea that the Jews who were there take, if you will, responsibility for the death of Jesus is unique to the Gospel of Matthew. What if? What would have happened had Matthew not? We don't know, right? We don't know. When I sometimes think about this, when an author has written a text that has a tragic history, do we need to hold the author responsible for this? Should the author have known or not? How are we to read this? Do we fault Matthew for the terrible, terrible history that this has led to? I think that's sort of the question that I would ask. The what if, we don't know. Do we take one more question or?
Yeah, I guess we have time for one more. Yeah.
One more, okay.
Oh, hi. Item 3A, paragraph 3A. Pontius Pilate says, you shall bear the responsibility. All the people answered, his blood will be on us and on our children. This is like when Kennedy died and Martin Luther King died. They all said, well, who killed them? We all have to bear this responsibility. And I'm thinking, why were the people so agreeable to take on this his blood will be on us. Why did they say that and not say, you and your Roman cohorts are the killers here?
Right.
Right, that would have been the normal thing to say.
Right.
Right, I think what this is not Matthew recording history, what actually the Jews said at the time. Again, this is my opinion. He is writing, again, knowing that the generation of these people's children, the temple is going to be destroyed. He is in a sense trying to explain why that happened. Right? Because you took the blame for this and on your children are going to see the temple be destroyed. And he didn't have in mind that in 2018 we'd be sitting here saying maybe the Jews are responsible today. He meant that generation and their children. And maybe not even all the generation, maybe just the leaders in Jerusalem who he felt were responsible for conspiring with Pontius Pilate to do that. And that's a subject that's up to historical debate. But that's the way he felt.
So allow me, if I may, to take off my Christian hat and put on my Rice University hat and point out to you that we have a fabulous, fabulous program in Jewish studies at Rice University, and you should all be on our mailing list. And I brought our beautiful propaganda that I designed myself. So I have a little brochure, and I have our latest newsletter. So if you're not already on our listserv, you should be. I have several examples out there. So please contact us, and we will be happy to put you on our listserv. We do lots of beautiful talks and conferences that are open to the general public.
Okay. I want to thank you all for coming this evening.